Former officer ordered the Black Royal Guard to leave, but the guard's calm response crushed him. The morning sun shone brightly over the palace grounds, reflecting off the golden spires and marble walls, giving the place an air of grandeur that seemed almost otherworldly. The courtyard was filled with quiet movement. Servants went about their tasks, carrying baskets of fresh flowers and trays of food, while attendants polished the marble floors. Despite the serene appearance, there was tension in the air, like the stillness before a storm. Today was not an ordinary day at the palace. Something unusual was about to unfold that would catch the attention of everyone present. In the midst of this grand courtyard stood a man whose presence immediately drew attention. He was a former officer, someone who had once held great authority and respect within the palace walls. His uniform, though now slightly faded, still carried the marks of his former rank. Every medal on his chest told a story of battles fought and duties fulfilled. Yet there was a sharp edge in his eyes, a mixture of pride and frustration, as if the world had somehow failed to recognize his importance now. The Black Royal Guard, on the other hand, was a figure of calm and unshakable discipline. He wore the palace's traditional dark armor that gleamed under the sunlight. His posture was straight, his shoulders firm, and his gaze steady. He had been trained for years to protect the palace, to follow orders without question, and to maintain decorum even under pressure. While others might waver or react hastily, he had mastered the art of patience and quiet strength. The former officer, walking briskly across the courtyard, stopped in front of the guard. He raised his hand, not in greeting, but as a signal of command. His voice cut through the morning air, sharp and demanding. "Step aside! Leave this area immediately!" he ordered. There was no question in his tone, no room for negotiation. He expected obedience because, in his mind, his rank and past achievements demanded it. The Black Royal Guard did not move. He remained in his position, his expression unreadable. He did not frown, nor did he speak. Instead, he simply stood there as if time itself had slowed down around him. The calmness in his demeanor was not weakness. It was a silent assertion of authority that came from years of training and an unwavering sense of duty. His stillness was like a wall that could not be pushed or broken. Around them, palace staff began to notice the confrontation. Whispers started spreading through the courtyard. "Why isn't he moving?" someone murmured. "Does the guard not recognize the officer's rank?" another asked quietly. The spectators could feel the tension rising. It was unusual to see the former officer, someone who had once commanded respect, struggling to assert authority in front of the Black Royal Guard. There was a sense that this moment was more than a simple exchange of words. It was a test of character, patience, and integrity. The former officer's frustration began to show. His hand twitched, and he clenched his jaw. He had always been used to people following his commands without hesitation, but now he faced someone who did not react the way he expected. He stepped closer to the guard, his voice rising slightly, filled with the weight of authority he assumed still belonged to him. "I said leave," he repeated, this time with more force. The words were meant to intimidate, to provoke a response that would assert his control. But the Black Royal Guard remained composed. He did not respond with anger or disrespect. Instead, he let his silence speak for him. His posture did not falter, his eyes did not waver. It was as if he were saying, without words, that authority was not about past titles or loud commands. It was about responsibility, duty, and respect. The guard's calmness had a subtle power, one that the former officer could feel pressing against him, yet he could not touch it. The crowd of attendants and palace staff had grown slightly larger, forming a quiet circle around the two men. Everyone sensed that something important was happening, even if they could not put it into words. There was a lesson in the air, a demonstration of what true strength looked like. The former officer's anger was visible now, his face flushed, his movements more agitated. He waved his hand impatiently, expecting compliance, but the guard's unwavering calmness only made him more frustrated. It was not just about obedience, it was about the clash of values. The former officer represented the old ways, where respect could be demanded through fear, reminders of past power, and loud commands. The Black Royal Guard represented a different kind of authority, one that could not be shaken by anger, impatience, or titles. His authority came from consistency, integrity, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew his role and performed it with honor. The former officer tried a different approach. He lowered his voice slightly, attempting a more persuasive tone. "You know who I am," he said, as if reminding the guard of his history and achievements would force compliance. "I served this palace. I upheld its laws. You will show respect." He expected the guard to hesitate, to falter, or at least acknowledge him. Instead, the guard's expression remained calm. He looked at the officer with steady eyes, neither mocking nor challenging, just observing. It was a gaze that seemed to measure the former officer not by his words or his past, but by his present character. The officer realized, perhaps for the first time, that respect in this palace was not given, it was earned. And no amount of reminders about past service could command it from someone who understood true duty. The tension in the courtyard became almost palpable. The air felt heavier, filled with anticipation. Everyone present could sense the subtle power struggle unfolding before them. It was a lesson in humility, patience, and the nature of authority. The former officer's attempts to assert control were failing, and the realization of that failure began to unsettle him. As moments passed, the former officer's frustration turned into a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. He had always believed that his rank, his medals, and his history gave him an automatic advantage in every situation. Yet here he stood, face to face with someone who neither feared him nor submitted. The Black Royal Guard's calm, unwavering presence was more commanding than any shouted order or visible display of past glory. Finally, the former officer took a step back, trying to regain his composure. He looked around at the silent onlookers, many of whom now seemed to admire the guard's poise. He realized that this confrontation was not just about him and the guard, it was about the values that the palace upheld. Titles and past service mattered less than courage, honor, and integrity. In that moment, the Black Royal Guard's calmness became a silent victory. Without raising his voice or making a dramatic move, he had demonstrated a kind of authority that no former rank could challenge. The courtyard seemed to breathe a collective sigh, acknowledging the quiet strength of the guard. The former officer, on the other hand, felt the weight of his irrelevance pressing down on him, a lesson in humility that he could not ignore. As the morning continued, the palace resumed its usual rhythm, but the events of that day lingered in the minds of everyone present. The former officer walked away, still smarting from the encounter, while the Black Royal Guard remained at his post, calm and resolute as ever. It was a moment that would be remembered, a story to be told to new guards and palace attendants, a lesson in how true strength is shown not through anger or commands, but through composure, patience, and unwavering dedication to duty. The first part of this story set the stage for what was to come. The confrontation had begun, tensions were rising, and the lessons about authority, respect, and moral strength were just starting to unfold. In the palace, it was clear that power was not about shouting commands. It was about quiet confidence, steadfastness, and doing what was right even when provoked. The tension in the palace courtyard did not fade as the morning progressed. The former officer, now visibly frustrated, paced back and forth, trying to figure out how to regain control. His mind raced with memories of the authority he once wielded. Every corner of the palace reminded him of the days when his word alone could direct soldiers and attendants alike. He had lived in a world where obedience was automatic, where his rank was unquestioned, and where the Black Royal Guard, or any guard for that matter, would have obeyed his orders without hesitation. But today, he was faced with a reality that he had not anticipated. The Black Royal Guard remained unmoved. Standing tall and composed, he watched the officer's agitation with calm precision. Every movement the officer made, every raised voice or sharp gesture, was met with stillness and quiet observation. To an ordinary person, it might have seemed like the guard was ignoring him. But those who knew the palace and its traditions understood that this was no ordinary behavior. The guard was not passive. He was calculating, assessing, and preparing to respond in a way that was powerful yet controlled. The former officer stopped in front of the guard again. He leaned slightly forward, as if to assert dominance, and spoke in a tone that was meant to intimidate. "I have given you an order. Step aside immediately or face the consequences." His words were heavy with authority, echoing through the courtyard, drawing the attention of every servant, attendant, and visitor who happened to be nearby. The tension was palpable. It was a moment suspended in time, where everyone waited to see which way the confrontation would turn. But the Black Royal Guard's response was not what the officer expected. Instead of responding with defiance or fear, the guard's voice emerged, calm and measured. "I understand your position," he said quietly, "but my duty is to protect this palace and its people. I cannot leave my post without proper orders." "That is my responsibility." The guard's words were simple, yet their effect was powerful. They reminded everyone present that authority did not come from anger or rank alone. It came from honor, responsibility, and commitment to duty. The former officer's frustration deepened. He had expected compliance, not a measured explanation. He had hoped that reminders of his past service would force the guard to obey, yet here was a man standing his ground with dignity and clarity. The officer felt a surge of anger, mixed with confusion. How could someone remain so composed in the face of blatant defiance? It was a question that gnawed at him, undermining his confidence. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the intensity of the confrontation. Whispers spread quickly as the attendants and servants tried to make sense of what was happening. "The officer is losing control," someone muttered. "The guard is not afraid at all," another whispered. It was rare to witness such a clash, where a former authority figure struggled to assert dominance over someone whose power was earned through integrity and discipline. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see who would make the first real move. The former officer, realizing that his usual methods were ineffective, attempted a different tactic. He lowered his voice slightly, trying to appeal to reason rather than command. "You should know your place," he said, carefully choosing his words. "I have served this palace with distinction. My experience and knowledge should not be ignored." He hoped that by appealing to the guard's sense of recognition, he could assert influence without relying on force. Yet the Black Royal Guard remained steadfast. His calm gaze did not waver, and his voice remained measured. "Experience is valuable," he said, "but respect and obedience are earned through consistent action, not reminders of past service. My duty is to ensure the safety and order of this palace. That is what matters now." The guard's words were precise and deliberate, cutting through the officer's attempt to assert authority. He spoke not with anger or sarcasm, but with clarity and unwavering confidence. The former officer's frustration turned into disbelief. He had spent his life believing that rank and title were enough to command respect. He had thought that a few medals, a few years of service, and the memory of authority would ensure compliance from anyone. But the Black Royal Guard's calm demeanor shattered that illusion. Here was a man who did not bend to intimidation, who did not react to threats, and who stood firm because he believed in the principles of duty and honor. The crowd began to notice the shift in dynamics. Where the officer had expected immediate obedience, he was now confronted with quiet resistance that spoke volumes. The guard's composure conveyed more authority than shouting or gestures ever could. People began to see that true power did not come from anger or past achievements. It came from character, integrity, and the courage to stand firm when challenged. The former officer's attempts to regain control became increasingly desperate. He raised his hand again, this time in a more aggressive gesture, and tried to intimidate the guard with his presence. "You will follow my order," he said firmly. "Do not test my patience." His words carried the weight of someone who had once commanded troops, but now lacked the influence he once had. The contrast between his expectations and reality was stark and growing more humiliating with every passing moment. But the guard's response remained calm, measured, and unwavering. He did not flinch, he did not react with anger, and he did not submit. His silence and composure were a form of strength that the officer could not overcome with force or words. The guard's presence was like a solid wall, impossible to push aside, and it conveyed an unspoken truth. Authority is not given. It is earned through consistent, honorable action. The officer, feeling the weight of the guard's quiet authority, tried to appeal to logic. "You should consider your position carefully," he said. "There are consequences for disobedience. I am reminding you of your duty." He hoped that by invoking rules and responsibilities, he could create fear or hesitation in the guard, but it did not work. The guard's understanding of duty was stronger than the officer's threats. He had been trained to uphold the palace's principles above all else, and no amount of intimidation could sway him. As time passed, the former officer's face grew red with frustration. His voice grew sharper, but his words began to lose their impact. The guard's calmness was unshakable, and it had begun to influence the crowd. The onlookers, who had initially been curious, were now impressed. They saw the guard's unwavering commitment and quiet strength as a demonstration of true authority. The officer's anger and desperation, by contrast, highlighted his loss of control and diminishing influence. The former officer tried one last approach. He stepped closer to the guard, lowering his voice to a threatening whisper. "Do you understand who you are speaking to?" he asked. He expected the guard to hesitate, to show at least a flicker of fear or doubt, but the guard's response was steady and composed. "I understand my role," he replied. "I also understand yours. Today my duty comes first. That is what guides my actions." The words struck the officer harder than any shouted command could have. They were not meant to humiliate him, yet they did. They conveyed that rank alone was meaningless without integrity, and that past accomplishments could not replace present responsibility. The officer felt a sinking realization that his attempts to assert authority had failed completely. The crowd's silence was now filled with quiet admiration for the Black Royal Guard. Attendants and servants exchanged glances, recognizing the guard's strength and discipline. The officer, once the center of authority in the courtyard, had become the center of embarrassment. His anger and frustration contrasted sharply with the guard's calm, creating a lesson in humility that everyone present could witness. Finally, the former officer stepped back, trying to regain some semblance of dignity. He looked around at the witnesses, but there was no support, only acknowledgement of the guard's unwavering presence. The Black Royal Guard, meanwhile, remained at his post, unchanged in demeanor, unchanged in purpose. His calm strength had turned the confrontation in his favor without raising a voice or resorting to force. The morning moved on, but the events of that day would linger in the memories of all who had witnessed them. The former officer had been taught, through experience rather than words, that authority is not a title, not a medal, and not a past achievement. It is a combination of integrity, patience, and the courage to stand firm when challenged. The Black Royal Guard had demonstrated that lesson perfectly, quietly asserting moral and professional authority over someone who had once considered himself untouchable. The courtyard eventually returned to its normal rhythm. Attendants resumed their duties, servants went about their tasks, and the palace carried on with the dignity and order it had always maintained. Yet the lesson was clear to everyone present. Respect and authority are earned through action, not demanded through threats or reminders of past glory. The Black Royal Guard had won the silent battle, proving that calmness, discipline, and unwavering duty are more powerful than anger, intimidation, or rank. Even as the former officer walked away, his pride bruised and his confidence shaken, he could not help but reflect on the encounter. The Black Royal Guard's quiet strength had left a mark, not just on him, but on all who had been present. It was a moment of teaching, a demonstration of true leadership, and a reminder that in the world of honor and duty, appearances and titles matter far less than integrity and courage. The tension in the palace courtyard had reached a point where every person present could feel it. In their bones, the former officer's pride was bruised, his patience worn thin, and yet he was determined not to leave the confrontation unresolved. He had spent his life in positions of authority, and the idea of being undermined, especially by someone he considered just a guard, was intolerable. His pride demanded that he regain control, to demonstrate that his voice and past service still carried weight. But the Black Royal Guard's calm, unwavering presence made that task more difficult than he had ever imagined. The officer straightened his back, squared his shoulders, and took a step closer. His face was flushed with frustration, and his eyes burned with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He tried to harness the authority he had once commanded, projecting it as forcefully as possible. "You dare to challenge my orders?" he asked, his voice rising slightly, though he attempted to keep it controlled. "Do you have any idea of who you are speaking to?" The guard's expression remained neutral, his stance firm, as though rooted to the marble floor. His eyes met the officer's gaze evenly, without intimidation, without fear, without anger. "I understand perfectly," he replied calmly. I am aware of your history, your service, and your past achievements, but today my duty is clear. I must protect this palace and follow the principles I have been entrusted with. That is not a challenge to you, it is my responsibility. The former officer felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. They were calm, measured, yet undeniable. Every attempt he made to intimidate, to assert control, was met with quiet reason and disciplined composure. For someone who had once commanded entire units with just a glance or a word, this was unfamiliar territory. He was used to obedience, to immediate compliance, to respect earned merely by holding a rank. And yet here he was, face to face with someone who refused to bend, whose authority was not given but demonstrated through restraint and principle. His frustration began to manifest in subtle but noticeable ways. He shifted from foot to foot, clenched and unclenched his fists, and muttered under his breath. The onlookers watched in silence, sensing that the situation was about to reach a tipping point. There was something extraordinary about this confrontation, not in its violence or drama, but in the clash of principles. On one side stood anger, pride, and expectation. On the other, calm, discipline, and unwavering integrity. The former officer attempted a different approach. He lowered his voice, hoping to reason with the guard rather than command him. "You should know better than to disobey someone of my experience," he said. "I have served this palace for years. My knowledge, my achievements, they demand respect. You would do well to comply for your own good." But the Black Royal Guard did not waver. He spoke evenly, carefully, and with clarity that left little room for misinterpretation. "Respect is not demanded," he said. "It is earned through actions, not by citing past achievements. I honor your service, but that does not change my duty here today. I am here to serve the palace and protect its people, and that is what guides me." The words struck the officer harder than any threat or shouted order could. He realized with a sinking feeling that his attempts to assert authority were failing. For the first time in years, he could not manipulate the situation by relying on his title or past reputation. The guard's calm and principled response had stripped away his leverage. Every command he had shouted, every gesture meant to intimidate, had been neutralized by the guard's unwavering composure. Frustration turned to anger. The officer's voice grew louder, his tone sharper. "You dare to defy me in front of everyone?" he demanded, hoping that public exposure would pressure the guard into submission. He tried to leverage embarrassment and fear as tools to regain control, but the guard's gaze never wavered. He did not flinch, he did not lower his head, and he did not respond with anger. The strength in his calmness became more apparent, more undeniable, and more intimidating than the officer's shouting. The crowd began to notice the shifting dynamics. Where the former officer expected obedience, he found resistance. Where he expected submission, he faced dignity and reason. The spectators' whispers became louder, filled with admiration for the guard's patience and poise. They began to understand that true authority was not about who raised their voice higher, or who had medals and titles, but about standing firm with integrity, even when challenged. In a last attempt to regain control, the officer tried intimidation through reminders of rules and protocol. "You must obey my orders," he said, gesturing sharply. "It is written that all personnel answer to their superiors. Disobedience will have consequences." He believed that invoking rules and regulations would force compliance, yet the guard's response was calm, precise, and unshakable. "Rules are important, yes," he said, "but they exist to maintain order and protect what is right, not to elevate someone's pride or past rank. I follow the rules not because I fear consequences, but because I understand my responsibility. My role today is to uphold the integrity of this palace, not to respond to personal ego." Every word from the guard landed with weight, undermining the officer's attempts to assert power. The former officer felt the humiliation creeping in, though he tried to hide it. He had never been in a situation where his authority was so completely neutralized without confrontation or resistance. The guard's calmness had created a mirror that reflected his arrogance, and he did not like what he saw. The officer tried one more tactic: proximity. He stepped closer to the guard, lowering his voice into a threatening whisper. "You will regret defying me," he said. He hoped the closeness, the implied threat, would force submission, but the guard remained unshaken. His voice, quiet yet firm, carried more authority than the officer's threats. "I will not regret doing what is right." he replied. "My duty is clear and my conscience is at peace. I do what must be done regardless of intimidation." The effect on the officer was immediate and profound. He realized that his reliance on fear, intimidation, and past rank could not break the guard's resolve. The very tools that had once secured obedience from others were powerless against someone whose strength was built on principle rather than fear. For the first time, he felt powerless, exposed, and vulnerable, not physically, but morally and psychologically. The crowd's attention was now fully on the two men. Attendants, servants, and even visiting dignitaries had stopped their routines, captivated by the display. It was more than a confrontation. It was a lesson in integrity and moral courage. People began to understand that the Black Royal Guard's calmness was not weakness. It was an extraordinary strength. The ability to remain composed under pressure, to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting emotionally, was a power that no title or medal could match. The officer, sensing the shift in perception, grew increasingly frustrated. His face was flushed, his breathing heavier, and his gestures more abrupt. Yet every attempt to reassert control was neutralized by the guard's unwavering demeanor. Every word he spoke, meant to assert authority, was met with quiet, principled resistance. The situation was no longer about orders or obedience. It was about the contrast between arrogance and integrity, between intimidation and honor. Finally, after several tense minutes, the officer stepped back, his chest heaving slightly as he tried to collect himself. The realization had sunk in. He could not force the guard to obey, and any further attempts would only further expose his lack of control. Meanwhile, the Black Royal Guard continued to stand tall, composed, and dignified, unaffected by the officer's anger. He had demonstrated that true authority does not need to shout or threaten. It is shown through calmness, clarity, and adherence to principle. The officer, now silently fuming, retreated a few steps, trying to maintain whatever dignity he could salvage. He realized that the confrontation had ended, not with violence or compliance, but with the guard's quiet victory. The lesson was clear. Authority derived from character, integrity, and duty far outweighs that derived from past achievements or fear. Even as the morning sun rose higher, bathing the courtyard in light, the memory of this confrontation lingered. Every person present would remember it, not for drama or spectacle, but for the demonstration of moral and professional strength. The officer, once confident and commanding, had been humbled by calmness and principle. The Black Royal Guard, standing firm and composed, had shown what it truly meant to lead and protect without arrogance or aggression. This moment would be retold countless times, a lesson for new guards, palace staff, and even future officers. True authority is earned, maintained, and displayed through patience, courage, and unwavering integrity. The officers' failed attempts at intimidation highlighted the difference between superficial power and real strength, while the guards' composed responses became a shining example of moral and professional excellence. By the time the morning's routine resumed, the courtyard had returned to its normal rhythm. Servants continued their work, attendants moved efficiently from task to task, and the palace life went on as it always had. Yet the encounter between the former officer and the Black Royal Guard had left a mark. It was a story of discipline over pride, of calmness over anger, and of principle over empty authority. The guard had shown, without raising his voice or striking a blow, that true leadership comes from steadfastness and integrity, not fear or status. The officer, walking away with a mixture of humiliation and grudging respect, understood the depth of the lesson he had been taught. The guard's calm and measured responses had crushed more than his authority. They had challenged his entire understanding of power. And as the courtyard slowly filled with the soft sounds of palace life once again, the Black Royal Guard remained where he always had, composed, vigilant, and unwavering, a silent testament to the power of character and the quiet strength of true duty. The palace courtyard, which had been charged with tension for hours, slowly began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The morning sunlight now felt warmer, reflecting off the marble walls and golden spires, but the air was still thick with the memory of the confrontation that had taken place. The former officer, once full of pride and authority, had retreated a few steps, his chest still heavy with frustration, and yet a quiet realization was settling in. He had come to face the Black Royal Guard expecting obedience, but he had been met instead with calm, unwavering integrity. That encounter would linger in his mind for a long time. The officer moved toward the edge of the courtyard, attempting to regain some semblance of dignity. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of his past authority had suddenly become a burden. He had always believed that respect could be commanded through rank, medals, and reminders of past service. Today he had learned a hard truth: real respect and authority are earned, not demanded. His face, once flushed with anger, now reflected the quiet sting of humility. Meanwhile, the Black Royal Guard remained at his post, a symbol of composure and steadfast duty. He did not relax, did not turn away, and did not gloat. There was no satisfaction in seeing the officer humbled, only a quiet affirmation of his own principles. He had acted in accordance with his training, his duty, and the honor of his role. That alone was enough. To him, the incident was not a victory over someone else. It was a demonstration of what it meant to uphold the values of the palace and the oath he had sworn to keep. Around the courtyard, the attendants and servants resumed their work, though their movements were quieter, more thoughtful than before. They had witnessed more than a simple confrontation. They had observed a lesson in courage, integrity, and the nature of true authority. Many whispered among themselves, discussing the way the guard had handled the situation without aggression, without fear, and without losing his dignity. For the palace staff, it was a moment to remember, one that would serve as guidance in their own duties. Some of the officers' former colleagues and acquaintances had lingered, curious to see how the situation would end. They watched silently as the officer walked away, realizing that his authority had been challenged not through physical force or loud commands, but through calmness, principle, and unshakable duty. The contrast between the two men was stark, one driven by pride and ego, the other guided by discipline and honor. The lesson was clear and resonated deeply with everyone present. True power is shown through character, not fear. As the officer disappeared from the courtyard, he could not help but reflect on the day's events. He thought about all the times he had relied on his rank to secure obedience, all the moments when respect had been automatic because of the uniform he wore or the medals he carried. But in front of the Black Royal Guard, none of that mattered. The guard had remained calm, had stood firm, and had adhered to his principles. That steadfastness had crushed the officer's expectations and forced him to confront a truth he had long avoided. Authority without integrity is fragile, and pride without humility is dangerous. The Black Royal Guard, meanwhile, continued his watch over the palace. He moved with the same precision, the same care, and the same sense of responsibility as if the confrontation had never happened. To him, his role had not changed. The palace still required protection, the people still required safety, and his duty remained. Yet the events of the morning had reinforced something quietly important: that courage and integrity are noticed, even in silence, and that true strength is measured by the ability to remain composed under pressure. By midday, the courtyard had returned fully to its usual order. Servants carried baskets of fruit and flowers, attendants swept the marble floors, and visitors wandered through the palace gardens. But the story of the confrontation had already begun to circulate quietly. Servants told each other of how the former officer had tried to assert authority, and how the Black Royal Guard had responded with calm precision. The tale was shared not to shame the officer, but to highlight the guard's strength and to reinforce the values of patience, integrity, and duty. The officer, sitting in his private chambers later that day, could not escape the memory of the guard's calm response. He replayed the confrontation over and over in his mind, each time noticing the way the guard had maintained composure, how he had spoken with clarity and principle, and how he had never resorted to anger or disrespect. The officer realized that his failure to command obedience was not because of a lack of authority, but because he had misunderstood the nature of true leadership. Leadership was not about demanding respect. It was about earning it through consistent, honorable action. The Black Royal Guard, in his own way, also reflected on the day. Though the confrontation had ended, he understood its importance. It was a reminder that maintaining discipline, calmness, and integrity in the face of provocation is not just a matter of personal pride. It is essential to the honor of the palace and the trust of the people he served. He knew that the lesson had been witnessed by many and that it would influence the way others approached their duties. That understanding brought a quiet satisfaction, a sense that he had acted correctly and with honor. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the palace resumed its evening routines. The fountains trickled softly, the gardens glowed under the fading light, and the staff moved with quiet efficiency. Yet the events of the morning remained etched in everyone's minds. The confrontation had demonstrated more than a struggle for authority. It had illustrated a fundamental truth about human behavior and leadership. It had shown that power is temporary when it is based on fear, but enduring when it is grounded in integrity and principle. In the days that followed, the story of the confrontation became a lesson told to new recruits and young attendants. They were reminded of the officers' failed attempts to command compliance and of the Black Royal Guard's unwavering calm. They were taught that discipline, patience, and a strong moral compass are more important than medals, titles, or past achievements. The Guard's behavior became an example to emulate, a model of how to handle difficult situations with grace and authority without aggression. The former officer, too, could not forget the encounter. Though pride and stubbornness lingered, he began to recognize the value of humility and self-reflection. He understood that the Guard had not humiliated him intentionally. Rather, he had demonstrated a principle that the officer himself had neglected. Slowly, he began to accept the lesson, realizing that his past rank could not protect him from the consequences of arrogance or poor judgment. It was a painful realization, but one that offered the opportunity for growth. Meanwhile, the Black Royal Guard continued his duties with the same dedication as ever. He patrolled the palace halls, ensured the security of the grounds, and supervised the younger recruits with patience and care. The encounter had not changed his responsibilities, but it had reinforced the importance of calm authority, moral courage, and unwavering commitment to duty. Every step he took, every command he gave, reflected the principles he had demonstrated in the courtyard that morning. As weeks turned into months, the story of the confrontation remained a quiet legend within the palace walls. Servants, attendants, and even visiting officials would recount it, not as gossip or entertainment, but as a reminder of what true authority looks like. The officers' failed attempts at intimidation were remembered as a cautionary tale, while the Guard's composed responses were celebrated as an example of moral and professional excellence. The lesson was clear. True strength comes from integrity, calmness, and courage, not from shouting, threats, or reminders of past achievements. The palace itself seemed to carry the memory of the encounter in its walls and corridors. The marble floors and golden spires had witnessed the clash, and the story became part of the palace's living history. New guards were trained not only in physical defense and protocol, but also in the subtle art of composure, patience, and moral strength, inspired by the Black Royal Guard's example. By the end of the day, the former officer had left the palace, but the impact of the encounter lingered. He had faced a force greater than any he had encountered before, the quiet, unwavering strength of integrity and principle. Though he carried away the sting of humiliation, he also carried a lesson that would influence his actions in the future. Respect, he realized, is earned through action and character, not commanded through fear or title. The Black Royal Guard, standing at his post as the sun dipped below the horizon, reflected briefly on the events that had unfolded. He did not boast, he did not seek recognition, and he did not feel the need to celebrate. His satisfaction came from knowing that he had acted according to his principles, upheld his duty, and maintained the honor of the palace. That alone was enough. As the night fell over the palace, a sense of calm returned to the courtyard. The fountains glimmered under the moonlight, and the gardens were bathed in silver shadows. Yet the story of the confrontation remained alive in the minds of all who had witnessed it. It was a story not of anger or victory, but of integrity, moral courage, and the quiet power of remaining composed under pressure. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Titles and past achievements can demand attention for a time, but they cannot replace character. Authority without integrity is fragile, but authority built on principle endures. The former officer's attempts to command compliance had failed because he had relied on past status instead of moral strength. The Black Royal Guard's calm and measured responses had triumphed because they were rooted in discipline, patience, and unwavering duty. In the end, the palace returned fully to its routine, but the events of that day left an imprint that would last for years. New guards learned from the example, attendants remembered the lesson, and even the former officer carried the memory with him. The Black Royal Guard had shown, without raising his voice, without aggression, and without seeking recognition, that true authority is earned, not demanded, and that moral strength can outshine pride and intimidation every time.